and unites all of us. And the heart of that mandate is our manifesto. I will deliver on its promise. A stronger NHS, better schools, safer streets, control of our borders, protecting our environment, supporting our armed forces, levelling up and building an economy that embraces the opportunities of Brexit, where businesses invest, innovate, and create jobs. I understand how difficult this moment is. After the billions of pounds it cost us to combat COVID, after all the dislocation that caused, in the midst of a terrible war that must be seen successfully to its conclusions, I fully appreciate how hard things are. And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened. All I can say is that I am not daunted. I know the high office I have accepted, and I hope to live up to its demands. But when the opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, only your willingness. So I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future, to put your needs above politics, to reach out and build a government that represents the very best traditions of my party. Together, we can achieve incredible things. We will create a future worthy of the sacrifices so many have made, and fill tomorrow and every day thereafter with hope. Thank you.
So the statement by Mr. Sunak, saying he's not daunted by the enormous task ahead of him, posing for the traditional photo on the threshold of power, on the threshold of number 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury at the age of 42, the youngest Prime Minister of the UK for 200 years, and the first British Asian to achieve the highest office. A statement, one of confidence, one of determination, but insisting that he does understand the pressure that people are feeling out there. Enters number 10 as Prime Minister, with a big round of applause from civil servants and officials and advisors in that traditional way, lining the corridor all the way down to the Cabinet Room to greet the new Prime Minister. Nick Eardley is still with me, and Nick, what did you make of the statement?
Never before have we seen a Prime Minister arrive and seek to so quickly draw a line under their predecessor's reign. Clear that Rishi Sunak wanted to say there, Liz Truss got some serious things wrong and I'm determined to fix them. He was very open about what he thinks the economic challenges coming are, some of the phrases he used again about profound economic challenge. And I thought he tried to address the complaint we're going to get a lot from opposition parties and from some of his own MPs about his mandate, because he said quite clearly there that he believes the 2019 mandate that the Conservatives got belonged to everyone, not just to Boris Johnson. And he's trying to say, I'm going to deliver what we promised at that election. But also from the new Prime Minister, a flavour of how difficult he thinks things are going to be, talking about how hard the economic picture is, about those difficult decisions to come, and I think setting up that economic statement next week, which is going to see spending cuts and tax rises.
Well, we're here in Downing Street, and we've just had that statement from Rishi Sunak, the UK's new Prime Minister. The world's media gathered, everyone snapping away with their cameras, of course, and listening to every single word of that. And among the crowd, Chris Mason, with us too, our political editor. And Chris, from your point of view, what were the things that he underlined in that statement that were for you the most telling, the most significant in terms of his intentions?
For me, the most striking thing before we even look at the language was his tone. His tone so striking in contrast with what came before. There wasn't the defiance, if you like, that we heard from Liz Truss in her departing address. Instead, in the language that he chose in just those opening few words, a recognition of the economic climate, a recognition too, a sort of knowing recognition that so many in the country have looked in on what's been going on in this postcode in the last 5 or 6 weeks in despair at the chaos that has unfolded within government, and that has had profound consequences for the popularity of the Conservative Party, but more importantly than that, for so many people's concerns about their own economic welfare, their own mortgages, their own capacity to look in on government and think that it has its interests at heart and knows what it's doing. So I think tone was really important from the new Prime Minister, but then also delivered in his own way, his own brand of defiance, as Nick was reflecting on there, a determination to, yes, say that he will try and deliver the 2019 election manifesto, which is the basis for the Conservative majority in Parliament, but also directly detach the idea that that was Boris Johnson's mandate, and instead say, look, this is a Conservative mandate, and I'm the new head of the shop. That was very explicit in the way that he said that. So he didn't say explicitly in the way that he had yesterday in his address to Conservative MPs that there wouldn't be an election anytime soon, but he said it without having to use that language, that he says, look, constitutionally I have legitimacy, but there was also, I thought, in his references to, if you like, his own political biography, not least the furlough scheme and his role as Chancellor during the pandemic, of him introducing himself to the country. Because not unreasonably, plenty of people over the summer may not have paid him all that much attention during that Conservative leadership race, not least because people might have better things to do over the summer, but also because he was the runner-up for so much of that, or the expected runner-up for so much of that contest. People were more likely to be paying attention to the likely new Prime Minister at the time in Liz Truss. So we saw there, and I think we'll see it again in the coming days, a sense of him introducing himself to the country, because not unreasonably, people might look in on proceedings this morning and ask questions about who he is and what his priorities will be and what his style will be. As I say, tonally, I thought that style so markedly different from either his immediate predecessor or the very near immediate predecessor before of Boris Johnson.
Well, it was very different to the style yesterday.
Yeah, it was.
Very different.
He was reading from paper as opposed to from an auto cue, perhaps something in that. No doubt he'll have picked up on some of the criticisms made on his own side as well as more broadly about the nature of his delivery in front of the camera yesterday. It felt more authentically him, and he felt much more, he sounded much more comfortable and much more natural. But again, on a human level, we should reflect that it's only 5 days ago that Liz Truss was here in front of her own lectern announcing her resignation. So this has been politics on a new kind of fast forward, even compared with what we've talked about in recent weeks, that he had to decide whether he was going to stand, decide what his pitch would be, speak to hundreds of Conservative MPs to try and persuade them, and then in the blink of an eye decide what his opening pitch to the country would be, all in the space of less than a week.
Hang on a second, because I think we can see a comment from Boris Johnson. Here we are. Congratulations to Rishi Sunak on this historic day. This is the moment for every Conservative to give our new PM their full and wholehearted support. Well, that's a generous message from Boris Johnson, as I'm sure he would see it, given that Prime Minister actually was making some rather generous comments about Mr Johnson as well. So there's a bit of mutual backslapping going on.
Yeah, generosity does tend to spring out at moments like this between political leaders and former political leaders, and Boris Johnson, if I remember rightly, bashed out a similar tweet 7 weeks ago when Liz Truss began, suggesting that the party should offer her 100% support. didn't quite turn out that way, and we know of the tensions that have existed between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. Of course, Rishi Sunak's resignation, one of those things that brought about the end of the Boris Johnson era. I think Mr Sunak has always worn quite heavily that accusation that he was somehow, to put it bluntly, some sort of political backstabber. It was his view that he had just reached the point where he couldn't defend the Boris Johnson administration anymore. But there's no doubt that perception, fair or otherwise, of Mr Sunak caused him damage in the race against Liz Truss over the summer. Without question, that was a problem.
A point that, I mean, both of you may want to say something, but Chris, just in terms of the mandate,
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by this point because, of course, you know, you've had lots of people saying, and we'll be talking to Annalise Dodds from Labour in a second, people making a case for a general election, you know, people making a case for millions of voters having a say in who the Prime Minister is. And it's interesting that today the tack was different, as you say. He wanted to talk about the validity of the mandate for the party.
Yes.
And the party's representatives at Westminster, who, as he would put it, happen to have chosen him now to lead them to become Prime Minister, and trying to distance himself from the argument for an election. Will that argument be enough for him to stave off these, I mean, he's clearly not going to give an election, but to stave off the kind of increasing demands that are there?
So, to the extent that, to address your point directly and what you were just reflecting on there, he holds the power. He and or a majority in Parliament hold the power on bringing a Parliament to a premature conclusion relative to its legal end and bringing about a general election. So you're going to hear the clamour from opposition parties, not least because so many of our opposition parties at Westminster now are very competitive. You look at where Labour is in the opinion polls, you look at the revival of the Liberal Democrats, you look at the ongoing dominance of the Scottish National Party in Scotland, and you look at the Conservative opinion polls, which are at incredibly low levels by any modern comparison. So they will continue to make that argument. They have, of course, a political argument to make because they can say, look, hang on, the Conservatives were elected under a Prime Minister, not even the last one, the one before that. But we should make the point that you only have to look to recent history. Gordon Brown became Prime Minister between elections, so did Theresa May, so did Boris Johnson, so did Liz Truss, and so did Rishi Sunak. Now, in Theresa May and Boris Johnson's terms, they both then fought elections and formed governments after those elections. The others didn't. So there's plenty of modern precedents where Prime Ministers in a parliamentary democracy assume office between elections. But that doesn't mean they don't face big legitimacy questions. And
Right.
Rishi Sunak knows that, and it's exactly why he sought to address it.
Let's stop for a second, Nick, because I want to bring in Annalise Dodds. We'll come back. Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, of course, and now Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities in the UK, member of the Shadow Cabinet. Annalise, good of you to talk to us. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. So, can we tackle the legitimacy question straight away? Because so many of your colleagues have been really underlining this point. What's your answer to the new Prime Minister's case today that, you know, the mandate is his party's mandate and therefore there is no question about the need for an election?
Well, that's wrong because Rishi Sunak is saying he's the answer when the problem ultimately is the Conservatives. I mean, Rishi Sunak has been part of those 12 years of Conservative failure, and people didn't vote at the last election for a high tax, low growth economy. But of course, Rishi Sunak was right at the heart of that. So we're not seeing the change that's needed for our country with this coronation of Rishi Sunak. Quite the opposite. He doesn't have a mandate, and we need a fresh start with a general election.
So let me just be blunt. You're not likely to get a general election, even if you make the case repeatedly. It's very unlikely to happen. Which then brings us to another question, which is, how do you then take the fight as an opposition? You're doing very well in the polls at the moment. How do you maintain that now that you have a new figure who will want to portray himself as a new start?
Well, ultimately, of course, Sunak is not a new start. He has presided over that economic failure. He's been right at the heart of those failing Conservative governments. And it's ordinary people, of course, who are paying the price. I mean, many people looking towards Monday, what seems to be setting up as a real kind of Halloween horror show of a fiscal statement likely to be coming from the Conservatives on Monday. They're really worried about their mortgages, they're worried about the rising cost of living, and that didn't just happen yesterday. That's been built up over those 12 years of Conservative failure. And Rishi Sunak's been at the heart of it. You know, Labour is setting out something very different to what Rishi Sunak is talking about. I know he didn't set out any proposals in his speech to obtain the growth that we need as a country. Labour set out our Green Prosperity Plan, really clear measures that we should be taking right now to get growth going again in our country, up and down our country, generate those new jobs that we need, and have the energy security we need to get people's bills down. We didn't see any content from Rishi Sunak, and we're going to be pushing very hard for that, because ultimately that's what would make the difference to ordinary people.
There is meant to be, as you know, this fiscal statement by the Chancellor next week, next Monday. Do you think that should still go ahead, or do you think that there should be a rethink of some of the elements that we've been familiar with so far, to give the government, maybe this government under Rishi Sunak, more time to think about how they repair some of the damage of the past few weeks?
Well, Labour set out measures that could be taken right now, and the government should listen to what Labour has set out. For example, around the windfall tax, of course, Rishi Sunak, only after many, many months of lobbying, not just from Labour, but also from many different organisations representing ordinary families, also from businesses, eventually Sunak put a version of the windfall tax on the books, but one that was riddled with holes, and one which hasn't ultimately been ensuring that the cost of energy in the future for families will be kept down. So he could and should be taking measures right now, again, those measures to promote growth that Labour set out in our Green Prosperity Plan. But I didn't see any indication, I have to say, in his comments just now, that he is going to be setting out those concrete plans. In fact, we've seen our country going in the wrong direction under the Conservatives, towards that high tax, low growth economy, and Sunak has been at the heart of that.
Annalise Dodds, good of you to join us. Thanks very much, and no doubt we'll hear more from you in the days to come. Annalise Dodds, therefore, Labour. Nick Eardley and Chris Mason are still with me. I should correct one thing, Chris, because earlier when we saw Mr. Sunak arriving at Downing Street, accompanied by, now turns out, a female colleague, Parliamentary Private Secretary, so if Akshad Murty is watching, I'm sorry, we couldn't quite see the image clearly enough, so at least we cleared that up. And interestingly, of course, Mr. Sunak decided that he would enter Downing Street alone and with no family.
Yes, and I think that speaks to a part of the image he's actually keen to project today.
Yeah.
That he did not want this to be seen as a moment of personal triumph, although of course it is. This wasn't a moment to have the family in tow. This was a business-like address from the very moment he arrived, and quite strikingly actually, as I was just watching him on the step posing for the photographers who were very keen to try and get him to smile, not unreasonable from a photographer's point of view. I think he was reluctant to do that because I think he recognises, he said this yesterday to Conservative MPs, these are his words, not mine, that the country has faced an economic and political crisis. Now, a political crisis somewhat brought about by his own party under his predecessor, and an economic crisis that she inherited and did her best to try and grapple with, and which he now inherits. So I think it's not unreasonable to assume in these situations that someone accompanying a new Prime Minister may have a spouse in tow, but it speaks to, I think, an intention on his part to project a very particular image, knowing that these images will be shared globally, and knowing that, whether it be in the financial markets just a few miles away in the city, or around the world, brand Britain on the global stage, which people in government acknowledge has taken something of a battering in the last couple of weeks, that these are the images that will be shared, and projecting that sense of a business-like sense of purpose really important.
So brand Britain, of course, depends on partly the people who represent us, and in these great offices. You're both going to hate me now. I'm going to say your nomination for Chancellor is?
Jeremy Hunt.
And Home Secretary?
It's a harder question. Maybe Grant Shapps, maybe Dominic Raab.
Okay, and then of course we'll have the Foreign Secretary.
What do you reckon, Chris? I'll leave that one to
Well,
you.
Foreign Secretary, very interesting. So, does the new Prime Minister want to find a big office of state? We've talked about the other two, and Foreign Secretary is the third of those, for Penny Mordaunt, who has been very much in the mix of the of the Conservative conversation. over the
Okay,
last few months.
we'll take that. Yes.
Or does he leave James Cleverly in post
Okay.
because he was a supporter of Boris Johnson as recently as Sunday? and
Well,
this
we'll
is
see.
The government of all the Conservative.
We will
talents,
see.
which
We're
is
out of
not
time.
about to do that.
And thank you all for watching. More on the news later, of course. But thanks for watching and bye for now.